Coming up next, the Gin Lady. Inebriate, inebriate.
Hello and welcome to BritCon 2021, where now we get to learn about gin. I'm Don Shaw. I'm an author and motivational speaker. I'm also the chair of BritCon. Today I have with me Malika, who is also known as the Gin Lady. Malika, could you say a few words about yourself?
Yes, hello, my name is Malika. Many people will know me as the Gin Lady. I'm slightly obsessed by gin. As you may see behind me, I have just a few bottles. Obviously, they're not all there at the moment because gin doesn't like bright sunshine, and at the moment, we have a lot of bright sunshine. So a lot of it is hidden away just in case I get carried away during this pandemic.
Yeah, it sounds like a worthwhile pastime. I actually hear you have quite a collection, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about that. So tell me, how did you get interested in gin?
Well, there was a company in the UK called Sipsmiths who managed to change the law on how much gin you had to produce. And that meant that instead of all those really large brands that we became aware of, such as Gordon's and Bombay Sapphire and Beefeater and all the big players, all of a sudden, smaller producers who were distillers in their own right that were producing things like whiskies and vodkas and things of that nature started to make some of the most amazing gins. And I think a lot of people will know that when we've drunk gin as we've been growing up and we've tried alcohol for the very first time, a lot of times people just say, I don't like gin, or gin make me depressed. Well, alcohol in itself is a depressant. If you drink too much of it, it's not gin per se. But I started trying gins, and I started finding that these master distillers were creating these amazing flavors with a cacophony of botanicals. It wasn't just about juniper. Obviously, I describe gin as being vodka with a personality, but gin just has to be a neutral grain spirit at 37.5% that has juniper in it. After that, all bets are off. And all of a sudden, people started creating these amazing gins. And I was very lucky to be in right at the beginning. And I started working with a company called Hendrick's, which many people may be aware of. And from there on in, my collection grew. And recently, I discovered that alcohol was the solution. And so my collection has spiraled slightly out of control.
Oh, there's no such thing as an out-of-control collection. Now, what I want to know is, where did gin come from? What's the history?
So I could give you a really long lecture on distillation and fractional distillation and the history of alcohol. But for the British, gin comes from Holland or the Lowlands or sort of Belgian areas. And when you start looking back at where gin comes from historically, there are many places you can pinpoint a juniper oil infusion into a base spirit. So around 1572, we start seeing this product being created. It was actually created as a medicine. So a professor created a medicine for lumbago, which is described as being a juniper oil in an alcohol distillate. So therefore, that was the first sign that we get of what we call Geneva. So that happened in 1572. And in 1575, a company called Bols. Now, many people will have seen Bols. They make alcohol still to this day. They're very famous in Antwerp and in Holland. They start commercially producing this Geneva. So this alcohol is being produced and starts to be exported. And what happens is you have the creation of a navy or of an East India company that starts taking this alcohol solution around the world. And where it starts to impact on England and Britain is where we start seeing things like in the 30-Year War, where British troops were sent over by Elizabeth I. they start drinking this thing that is called Dutch courage. So it's served in medicine bottles, and it is given to the Dutch troops, and it gives them courage. It gives us this false sense of courage, and it's alcohol. It's effectively Geneva, and this starts coming into the UK, and we start to see it in places like Portsmouth, into Leith, a massive port in Scotland. In fact, Scotland had such a huge gin industry at one point. Although when I say industry, what I mean is distilleries that were happening in back rooms everywhere. It was a huge thing. And so that's where it starts to seep into England. And then what happens is we have William of Orange, who is a Dutch king who becomes king of England. And with him comes the fashion of Holland. And that fashion is Geneva. So all of a sudden, we are drinking a Protestant gin. It becomes very fashionable in his court. We no longer want to be drinking sort of the brandies and the wines of the Catholics, of the Spanish. And so the British really do start to take up the creation of this drink called gin, or gen. So Geneva becomes gen, it becomes gin, and that deterioration into what then becomes the gin craze in London is this horrific spirit that when you look back historically at some of the ingredients that were going in, you've got things like sulfuric acid, turpentine, there's almond oil, just to give it a different flavour. You know, there's all these really bizarre things going into it. And so the gin craze starts to happen. And at one point, every man, woman and child in London was drinking 22 gallons of gin because it's cheap. Because they bring in, there's many gin acts that happen, but the first one is that we allow anybody to create or distill gin. And so what happens is this craze where, and it sounds fashionable, it sounds fantastic, gin craze, and obviously at the moment we're in another gin craze, but this time drinking responsibly, you won't die from gin. Back then, during the gin craze, the probability is that you would. And in fact,
well, if you were putting turpentine in it, I can kind of understand why you might have done that.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing is that the death rate starts to exceed the birth rate, and 75% of all children die under the age of 5 through infant mortality, and that is either through what we then see as mother's ruin, which is mothers drinking so much gin they can't look after their children, or birth defects, which happen because of the alcohol. So it's not a nice period in time. And in fact, there was a huge piece of propaganda, which is by an artist called Hogarth. Now, Hogarth was an artist of the day, and what he tried to do was to show the difference between beer and gin. So he created Beer Street and Gin Lane. Now, people can see these etchings online if you can't see all the details here that are in these pictures. But what should be very obvious is that in Beer Street, everybody's fat, everybody's happy, everybody's joyous, everybody's healthy. Whereas in Gin Lane, you've got the biggest image is the mother dropping her child. That's mother's ruin. That's where we start to see that phraseology coming through. And she has syphilis. She has sores on her legs. The man sitting below her is selling pamphlets, but he is a troop. He's come back from war and he's gaunt. He has no food because he spent all his money on gin. In fact, the only people profiteering in that picture are the pawnbroker and the undertaker. So they're the people who actually have the money, because that's where people are going. They're giving their stuff to the pawnbroker to get money to buy gin. So the gin craze sounds great, but the reality is that it was really not a good time in history. And it wasn't until we had a failure of grain in the country that meant that gin stopped being produced in such great quantities. And we were able to then, rather than create this horrific gin that was drunk heavily by the population, they were able to start producing real gins, and that's when we see companies like Gordon and Company and Greenall's. They are the companies that start to produce gins that are seen as the gins that we possibly would be drinking today. So a really interesting period in history. And from that have come some very, very interesting gins.
Well, let me ask you, when you said earlier that people were drinking 22 gallons, was that like the average consumption per person, like per year, or?
Yeah, no, that's per year, and that's for every man, woman, and child. So that's a huge amount of gin that is being consumed by people.
Yeah, especially if kids are drinking it. And it's not surprising at all that the death rate was so high, either from overconsumption or, like you say, the poor quality of the ingredients.
Mm. Yeah, no, it wasn't a good period in history. But what we have got from that is that you know, these gins that were produced at the time are what we call compound gins. So a compound gin is looking for something to show you now that is a compound gin. Probably the best one is going to be something like this one. So this one's called bathtub gin. Now, you might be familiar with the phrase bathtub. A lot of people think that that means that they made gin in bathtubs. It doesn't at all. Bathtub gin relates to sort of the Prohibition years when they were making this at home and they were compounding it by putting the flavours in a neutral grain spirit. So basically, an alcohol base, you chuck in your flavours, which have to include juniper, but other than that, it could be, as we were talking about earlier, turpentine. It could be anything. And then you effectively sieve out the bits, and you are left with a compound gin. So bathtub gin is called that because they used to then top up the large containers with water to break down the amount of alcohol and to lower the ABV, but also to make it go a lot further. They used to top up the bottles in the bathtub because you couldn't get it under the faucet in a normal sink. So that's where it gets its name from. But this one is the sort of the historical compound gin is what they were producing at that time. And that's what you get from that period in history, which is a nice gin if you like your gin pokey. I think that's the best way to describe it. When you start looking at a lot of compound gins, they have a colour to them. So when you look at them, they look like a sample, because when they sieve out the bits, it doesn't always have to be that they do it through a really good filter. It can literally be they sieve out the bits. And so you're left with this coloration to it. So this is this one's a really nice gin. This is Abelforce, so this is and again, what they've tried to do with this particular gin is they've tried to mimic the style. So it's paper covered, wax topped, string wrapped, and so this is the idea that you sort of, it's almost like a brown bag gin, if that makes any sense. And I'm just going to pour a tiny amount here.
So what makes the difference in quality? I mean, the bathtub is a compound, but you're saying that this one is a brown bag, but it also is high quality. So can you explain how that's differentiated?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the difference in quality of gins will be your master distiller. So it'll be the person that makes the gin and the way that they make the gin. So just because it's called compound or gin, a lot of people have negativity towards it and they see it as a lower style of gin. But this could be your gin of choice. If you, like I say, if you like your gins pokey. So this one is juniper forward without a doubt because it has to have juniper in it. But you will get lots of flavour in this. So you will get lots of, if there's citrus in there, you'll get a lovely citrus kick. All of the different flavours that this person has put in here will be forward. So this is a really good gin. So when you start to look at redistilling gins, there's so many different ways that you can go about it. So maybe the best way is to go back a little bit in the story and start talking historically about the nature of what came next in the gins. So compound is where we sort of start with things. And then we go on to what is called Old Tom. So this in the UK is a really cheap Old Tom gin. It's actually really good. So about 5-6 years ago, a lot of our cheaper brand supermarkets, which is Lidl and Aldi, decided that they realised that gin was going to be the next big thing. And so what they needed to do was they needed to be early adopters. They needed to get in, get good gins at good prices, and then really try and grab the market. And they did with things like this one. This is Gin Lane 1751. It's an Old Tom gin. So Old Tom gins are sweet. So if you like your gins with sweetness, these are great gins to try. Now, initially, that sweetness would come from something like licorice, but more recently, it comes from sugars. You can get it from honey as well. And right at the beginning, when these are starting to be produced, that was a masking agent. So they added the sweetness to cover all the other flavours. These days, we don't have that problem. There is just a sweet essence to it because that's the nature of the gin. So we're not masking anything these days. We're making lovely gins. Now, I particularly like Old Toms as gin and tonic bases because I like the sweetness, because I think for me personally, it counteracts the bitterness of quinine. So if you're drinking a gin and tonic, quinine will be involved in there. So Old Tom is a lovely gin. The name, there's so much debate about it. So there were these things called Puss and Mew shops. Now, the name Old Tom probably doesn't come from Puss and Mew shops. It probably comes from, there was Thomas Chamberlain and Thomas Norris. Now, Thomas Chamberlain was Old Thomas, and he was the master distiller. And young Thomas took with him some of the recipes of Old Thomas, and the barrels that he took onto a new gin shop or gin palace were Old Tom's gin. So when you start seeing Old Tom's gin, it probably relates to this story. However, there are many things to discuss it. But Puss and Mew shops actually came around as part of that gin craze that we talked about earlier. And the image that you've got on your screen right now is a replica that's on display at the Beefeater Museum. And this would actually have been on a door of a Puss and Mew shop to hide the fact that they were selling illegal compound gins. And what you would do is you would put your penny into the mouth of the cat, and you'd put it in for Puss, and he knew by you'd put your gin bottle underneath his paw, and as you see there's a pipe, and he would give you a measure of gin. And so they were Puss and Mew shops. So you would look for these doorways as you went around London.
That's absolutely, I love that. I'm a cat person. So, of course, I understand where you think about Old Tom as the possibility that it could have been Thomas and Tomcat. But whereas in reality, it was probably named after a person. But I imagine that there's a lot of fun being made with people being able to say that Tom could be Tomcat as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you start looking at the history of gins, there's going to be so much that we don't know because it isn't written down. It's that oral history, isn't it? So we're looking for those stories. So there's things like Samuel Pepys. He wrote a diary, and he starts talking about Geneva coming into Britain as he had constipation, and he was given a juniper infused water. Which was at that point Geneva. So we only start to see Geneva and gin coming in through those sort of places. But a lot of that information either got burned, disappeared, or was lost in history. So a lot of really good stories, a lot of mythology around gin. And I'm sure that the more you drink of it, the better the stories get.
Hey, I have one question. You were talking about a gin being pokey. Now, can you translate that for us Americans, what you mean by pokey?
So it can either be the ABV, which is the alcohol by volume, which is if you like your gin strong, then you can start to go towards overproof, which we have remarketed as Navy strength. So in the 1990s, they started calling these gins Navy strength. So if you like your gin strong and really hits home, then Navy strength's great because it's not just about the alcohol content that is higher, but they also up the botanicals. So pokey is you like it flavoursome, you like it rich, you like to. It's not a subtle drink. It's not a sip. It's not just a gin and tonic that you drink on a Friday night. It's a I've finished work on a Friday. it's been the worst week ever. I want to sit with a sipping gin, and I want to taste everything. I want my mouth to explode with all those flavors. So there are gins that will do that for you, and then there'll be other gins that, like I say, you can just drink because they're fun. There's certainly the fruit gins. So this was my gin of the week a couple of years ago, and this is Puerto de Indias. This is a strawberry gin. So I drink this like I drink pop, fizzy pop, because it is a gin. It's not a gin liqueur. It's already of the ABV 37.5, so that makes it gin. But this is sweet. This is so sweet. This is strawberry heavy. You can definitely still taste the juniper. It's still in there. But this one, if you get yourself a nice highball of ice and pour this over it, that on its own is a fabulous experience. But you drink, it's not the sort of drink that you want to sit down in the garden and keep drinking and can't stand up afterwards because, there goes the weekend. But this one is flavoursome, but it doesn't explode in your mouth. It's an enjoyable experience. So there's lots of different gin experiences that you can have. It's not a simple drink. I mean, we can say, there's loads of people who say, I don't like gin. Now, my response to that is you haven't tried enough yet. And that's it, because just here on the table, I could show you a huge variety of gins that you wouldn't know were from the same category or the same class when you start to blind taste. It's always worth giving it a try. And obviously that's for science. So, you can say you're doing it for science.
So also what you're suggesting is don't judge all gin just because you've had some that you didn't like. Now, I have to say, up until about a week ago, I would have said that I did not like gin because any experience that I have had with it hasn't been good. And in fact, we had a fan question. Somebody made that very statement. They said, and I'll just read it. He said, when I was younger, gin tasted like I was drinking a pine tree, so I have avoided it for 30 years. If I were to try gin again, which brand should I try so that I have a better experience with it? And I think you've answered it, because you said just keep trying until you find something you like.
Yeah, but I think there's a really good starting point. So what you can do is you can start by thinking about what is it that you enjoy taste-wise. So do you like sour? Do you like sweet? Do you like citrus? Do you like floral? Do you like savoury? Because when you start looking at the different profiles of gin, you will find something that will tick all your boxes. So, there are gins that are citrus heavy. There are gins like Gin Mare. It's a fantastic Spanish gin that has loads of rosemary in it. And that one in itself is very savoury. So that's a lovely gin to drink as a savoury drink. We've got lots of fruit gins, like I said, about Puerto de Indias. That's a strawberry gin. But say, for example, you like your citrus. This is Tanqueray Seville. This one's a lovely, Tanqueray is a fantastic gin brand, and they also make some really interesting different flavour profiles from things like India. So looking at other gins like Ophir, that's got a beautiful different spice mix to it. So think about what you like as a flavour, and then start doing a bit of research. Now, you can do that online. Every gin company will have their flavour profiles. Most of them will give you their botanicals, so they'll tell you what it is that goes into their gin. And then think about what it is you want to experience from your gin. So, for example, if you want to drink your gin as, say, for example, something light, so you can drink something called a gin liqueur. So gin liqueurs are sweet, they're liqueurs, they're not 37.5% ABV, so they're not heavy on the alcohol side of things. But you can then start thinking of things like mixing that with Prosecco. So you can have a beautiful, long, sparkling glass of Prosecco with a gin twist. So there's companies like Edinburgh. I'm just looking to see if we've got anything on this. Yes, I have. There we go. So Edinburgh do pomegranate and rose liqueur. So I'm sure there will be equivalents, but these are called gin liqueurs. And these make fantastic long drinks. And again, you can drink these with less alcohol included. So that's a really nice way to drink it. If you want a gin and tonic style gin, then this saying is a great for gin and tonic. There are gins that are great cocktail bases because they have a great flavour profile that works with other things. And they're fantastic. And then there's sipping gins. So there's gins that you can just enjoy just drinking neat, maybe over ice, because it's always better when it's cooled. And then just think about how you drink your gin. So actually, if you put a bit of research into it and have a look what's out there, and then the best thing to do is to go to a bar that has a great gin menu. And what you do is you go through the menu, having done your research, and start buying one shot, because one shot's not going to set you back, a huge amount of money unless you go to a really expensive gin bar, obviously. And ask the person serving you if they can serve you your gin and your tonic separately if you're drinking gin and tonic, and try the gin. Taste it with ice, taste all the flavour profiles, and then pour your tonic in, and then drink it with gin and tonic, and then decide what you like. And just enjoy that process, because it's a lovely process till you find not just your gin, but your gin profile. So you'll then discover what it is that you like from this massive array of gins that are available.
Okay, so let me ask you one other thing. You talked about different type of gin, different types. What I have with me today is a London Dry, and I think that's the one that you haven't covered yet.
There's a couple of gins I haven't covered yet. So the next part of the process as we go from compound to Old Tom's is we then go on to London Dry. Now, London Dry is where we see the introduction of a new type of still. So what we see is we go from these pot stills, which are these copper pots where the alcohol is steeped in, the botanicals are steeped in the alcohol. So here on your screen you can see it, there's two different types. So your pot still, effectively you put your alcohol and your botanicals and anything you want into that still, and then what happens is you heat it up, the alcohol rises, and then it's got a condenser unit, so it condenses it back from steam into liquid. But what you get with pot still type gins are your very flavoursome because it's steeped in it. But what happens then is a chap called Kofi comes along and creates the column still, which is where London Dry comes from. Now, what happens here is the alcohol steams gently through the still, and in each part of that still there are little wire baskets that have the botanicals in them. And what happens is the alcohol takes with it gently the flavours that they go through. And then again, another condensing part of the process means that steam then becomes liquid again. And normally what comes out of these is very, very, very high alcohol. And then the distiller will take that back with water. So they normally have water added at that point. And the important thing is London Dry is one of those EU regulated gins. It doesn't have to be made in London, it can be made anywhere. It's a style of gin. And so what they need to do is they need to take it through three processes, which is that they need to distill it to a high percentage, then redistill it, and then they need to add water. They need to ensure it has little to no sugar added, hence the dry, which is what the name that comes from after Old Tom being sweet. And they cannot add any flavours in after the distillation process is completed. So a London Dry gin is exactly what it says on the tin. It hasn't got very much sugar, if any, or any sweetness added to it. And it tends to be the most traditional gin. It's the one that most people would have drunk at some point. I've got loads of different London Dries that are styles of London Dry on the table here. It's not my preferred gin of choice, but there are some really good ones that are produced out there. And you've got quite a few really good column still produced gins as well in the US that I've got carried away with quite recently. So I was very lucky to go on a trip to San Francisco recently, and there's St. George's is the distillery there, and they make some fantastic gins. So I may have drunk quite a lot of theirs recently.
So are you ready to move on to actually demonstrating cooking with gin? Or did you have a little more you needed to talk about first?
No, I've got one more gin. So the one more gin that we would like to talk about is Navy Strength. So this is probably the world's most famous Navy Strength gin. It's called Plymouth Gin. And the difference being is that Navy Strength gin Like I said a little bit earlier, it's called Navy Strength now. In the 1990s, we rebranded it, but it's actually just overproof. Now, this is 57% alcohol, so the ABV. These are the gins that are a lot higher. And all that happened was, so what we need to consider historically is that because of the Navy taking gin out into the world, it took it through the spice routes. So spices came into the ports thanks to the merchant navies, the East India companies, all of those sort of things. So the spices came in, they made the gins with those spices, and then the gins were exported out around the world. And the Navy would have gin as part of the officers' ration. So we always hear of grog and the tot of rum for the sailors. Well, officers would have gin, but the Navy had to make sure that what they were buying was a good enough quality. And so what they would do is they would look for proof. So when we talk about overproofing, what they would do is they would twist black powder and then they would dip it in the alcohol and light it. Now, if it was the right proof, that the black powder would still light, it meant that it was over 57% ABV, which means it's above 100 or 114 proof, which means that the alcohol content is really high. So the Navy Strength gin is always going to be a really high gin content, and so that's how they prove that. There's lots of great Navy Strength gins. In fact, if anybody, if anybody can get hold of this one, this one's really difficult to get in the UK. This one's called Conniption. It's a Navy Strength gin that comes out of the Durham distillery, but I believe they're based in the US. This was the winner of the Navy Strength Gin of the Year for 3 consecutive years, including last year, I believe. So if you like a good gin, that one in itself is fantastic. And the Navy story is also really important for gin and tonic, because I'm now going to show you how to make what I believe is the perfect gin and tonic. But what you need to know is it was never gin and tonic. It was always tonic and gin, because when the Navy started going out around the world, we had this terrible problem called malaria. And so luckily, these 2 French scientists discovered quinine, which was an anti-malarial drug. Unfortunately, quinine tastes disgusting. And so what they would do is they would take lemon or lime, sugar, carbonated water and quinine and make a tonic with it. And the British decided to add gin to it to make it even more flavoursome. So the reason that we have gin and tonic today is because of malaria. So tonic went out around the world. And the interesting thing is, if you are, putting some time and effort into finding a good gin, find a good tonic. Good tonics are essential. You put the ratio of the perfect gin and tonic, as far as I'm concerned, is 2 to 1. So 1 shot gin to 2 shots of tonic. So you are getting more tonic in there. So that's really important that you get a really good quality tonic. And the other thing to be aware of is many of us have been drinking cheap tonics for years. And until people like Fever-Tree, who are probably one of the biggest in this country, started producing a tonic with real quinine as opposed to quinine flavors, people started to get ill. And it wasn't alcohol that was the problem, it was quinine, because we have allergies against quinine. So you start drinking gin and tonics with a really good quality tonic and you start getting poorly, add more gin is my solution to the problem. But yeah, and the only other thing that I have neglected to mention is, if you do find a Navy vessel with a green and white pennant on it, please be aware that that is a gin and tonic pennant. Now, this is a real thing. The actual one on the screen there has a martini glass in the middle. Those are a recent addition. But actually, the green and white pennant, if any Navy ship is showing that, it means that the officers are welcome to come aboard to enjoy a gin and tonic and have a talk or discussion. And our first actual pennant that we are aware of is 1944. It's in a photograph, and this is from, I think it's called the USS Gunnell. And although that's a black and white shot, you can see that there is a green and white pennant there. So that was the pennant that the officers held up. Should we have a gin and tonic?
Oh, sure. I think that sounds... I am going to actually demonstrate everything that you said not to do. I'm going to use a really cheap tonic because I didn't know any better. And I'm also going to use dry gin because I didn't know any better. So
No.
There we go.
That's fine. No. Honestly, gin and tonic, your way, you do it with your gin. So if a dry gin, if you want a dry gin, that's fantastic. The first thing you need to think about is your glass. Now, this is the one that everybody's using at the moment, or predominantly, and this is a copper. Now, these are really good for several reasons. The first thing is it's a nice big bowl, so it means that you can get lots in there, including lots of ice. It's got a nice surface area, so when you're smelling your gin, you're getting all of those flavours. And most importantly, with the ice, you're not holding it around the glass, so it means that you're not going to melt the ice. So a stem's good. So this is that's a good gin glass for a gin and tonic. The other one that people use is the highball or a Collins glass. Again, really good. You've got lots of small surface area on the top to stop the carbonation disappearing. Again, you get lots of ice in it, it's really good. And then the other thing is that you'll find that lots of gin companies are starting to produce their own glassware. So this is from a company in Ljubljana. It's Broken Bones, fantastic gins. And this is their glass, and they like it for nosing. So you can actually drink, this is really good for sipping gins as opposed to gin and tonic. So thinking about your glassware is always good. So this one is what I'm going for. So this is your balloon or your copper. And the first thing you need to do is, as I've sat here waffling, my ice has started to melt. So that's not a good thing. But what you need to do is fill your glass with as much ice as you can get in there. Now, this is going to be noisy. I mean, if you can't hear, I just use my fingers. And the other thing that you can do is, if you prefer and you're feeling as though you need to get some of that fruit and veg back in your diet, is use frozen fruit. So you can use frozen fruit at this stage, because then you will get the ice, so it will act like ice, but also at the end you get to eat it, and it's great. So that's my ice. I've not filled it up as much as I have. You've done a brilliant job there. And all I'm doing is I'm just swirling the ice around just to chill my glass. And then this is something you'll never see me do, but I'm going to measure, okay? So this one I'm using is, this one's Edinburgh Cannonball, and this is a Navy strength gin. Now, this is a fantastic gin. Lovely sound. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to add a large measure. So I would normally go for 2 ounces. So we're just going to put in there. Some of that got away. So that's just going in there. Now, the really important thing is to now add your tonic, so that you're not losing any of your carbonation, but you are mixing your drink. So I know from Edinburgh Gin that their tonic of choice is Fever Tree Aromatic. So this particular tonic is what they suggest I put in this gin. So that's the only reason I'm using it. Now, I like to use small bottles or cans, because then you're not losing the carbonation time and time again and ending up with flat at the end. And all I'm going to do is, I'm not going to measure it, I'm going to free pour it, but I'm looking for about a 2-to-1 measure. So if you want to measure it, Dawn, that's cool. Like I say, I'm just going to free pour what I think is the equivalent of 2 measures there. And what I want to do is not lose much of the carbonation, so that's about the right amount. And that, for me, is my perfect gin and tonic. Now, at this point, you can add a garnish. So I know that Edinburgh Gin say I can add lemon and lime. I'm not going to, that's personal choice, because I've got aromatic, but you've done it perfectly there. That's great. If you want to squeeze some of the citrus in, because you've got a London Dry, if your botanicals include citrus, you can add, because that is a really nice citrus kick then. And then a garnish doesn't have to just be there to look at. It can actually be part of the flavour profile. And that's really good. And then just purely because I enjoy drinking it with a straw. That's absolutely lovely. So that, for me, is my perfect gin and tonic. Nice and cooling at the end of a day. And I hope you enjoy, making and seeing how it goes for you.
Now I have a gin and tonic, so we're going to see how the rest of this interview goes.
Okay. I'm sure we can carry on.
Well, that was lovely. Actually, that was a lot of fun. I did improvise a little bit. I brought my own measuring tools and the lemon and lime. So, but you also use gin for cooking. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering if you would at this time want to move on to actually making something for us.
No, absolutely. Let's make something. So I think that the perfect accompaniment to a gin and tonic is a Sunday afternoon tea. So what I'm going to show you is how to make a really simplistic gin lemonade scone with 3 ingredients. So, as if by magic, here's one I prepared earlier. So those are the gin and tonic scones. Sorry, not tonic, gin and lemonade scones. So, Keith, would you just so kind as turn the camera so that people can see what we're doing? Okay, so what I've got here is 450 grams or 3.5 cups of self-raising flour. If you don't have self-raising flour, you can use 450 grams of plain flour and then add 7 flat teaspoons of baking powder. So that's, you're just putting that raising agent back in. And then the next thing that you're doing is adding your gin element. Now, in the UK, we get a lot of these. So this one is Bloom London Dry Gin with rose lemonade. So all I'm doing is using this lemonade instead of traditional lemonade. Now, if you want to do this without the gin, you can use just straight lemonade. You can't use a diet lemonade, you need the sugar. So this is where we get our sweetness for our scones. So this is 270 millilitres, 75 millilitres. I need 240 millilitres of this. And then I need 240 millilitres of double or heavy cream. And that's it. That's all I'm going to add into here. So again, a little bit of guesswork to make that less than 240. Yep, up there. And then this one's got a nice measure on the thing for me. So if I take that to 100, we'll be fine. A little bit more. There we go. So all you're going to do at this stage is it looks like that. All the froth has started to come up. You want to try and now combine all of that into your flour gently. So we're not going to do lots of whisking. We're just going to gently mix that in. And this is about incorporating that gin flavour into our cooking. So it's now all starting to come together. And at this point, I've not been heavy with it, so I want to keep some of that carbonation in there. You've got a sticky mess. So now I'm going to place a little bit of flour on my work surface, which I have cleaned before I did this, and will be cleaned in a moment as well. And then this sticky mixture, you just pull it out onto that floured surface. And this is where you've got to be really gentle with it. So all you need to do is fold it in until it becomes flat. Like I say, it is a sticky mixture. So I might need a bit more flour on my hands. And this is where the cat comes in to see what I'm doing. So you just want to combine it so it's just folded in. There we go. Now that's about the right consistency. So, and then we just flatten out with our hands. So that's it. That's as simple as it gets. I do apologise, my hands are really messy now. And now the next bit is the important bit. So I've got my cutter. If you don't have cutters, you can use a glass or a bottom of a metal can that you've cut out. And all I'm doing is I'm putting it in flour, so it's floured. And then I'm just going to do one push straight through. Don't twist, because you're going to break down the glutens around the edge. And then we're going to lift up, and we're just going to keep doing that. And then I'm going to flour it again, because it's starting to stick, and you don't want that. I'm going to go down, flour again, see if I can get one on the end there. And that's that. And then we're going to pull away the excess, which we can then again gently turn to do the next lot of scones. And then what I'm going to do is use my spatula here, and my glamorous assistant is going to bring in the greaseproof paper, And I'm just going to put these on my greaseproof paper. And the best thing to do with these is actually to try and stand them next to each other. There we go. And again. And lastly, that one. I'm going to chase across the table. These fingers separated. And there we go. So all you want to do then is egg wash across the top, and then we're going to bake them until they're golden brown. Now you want to do this at 200 degrees centigrade or 180 degrees centigrade if it's fan, and I think it's 350 degrees Fahrenheit, if I can remember that off the top of my head. And while you read those instructions, I'm just going to quickly wash my hands.
I wish my mic wasn't muted so I could actually say something. All right. So that looks fabulous. I think this would be, I wish I could try one. You have to put one in the mail to me.
I'm back.
Well, it is, yeah.
So this is what your scones will look like once they're baked. Now, the really good thing about these is that there's no fruit in them, but if you like fruit in your scones, soak your raisins or your sultanas in gin for as long as you want in advance. Put them in a jar and put gin over the top and soak them so you've got lovely gin-soaked fruit, and then you can bake those into these. That's really lovely. You can, if you like citrus styles, you can also do the same thing with zest. So you can very thinly cut lemons or lime zest or grapefruit zest, place that in gin so you're almost caramelizing it, and then you can put that in your scones as well. It's really nice with a little bit of honey, so citrus and honey is a lovely mixture as well. But the great thing about these being really plain is you get a little bit of sweetness from the lemonade. You get obviously a little bit of gin through, and then you get the creamy dairiness of cream, which makes a really lovely base for a good quality jam, which I've made a gin jam, strangely enough, and cream. So that's the perfect afternoon tea as far as I'm concerned, which I would enjoy with my gin and tonic.
On the subject of food and cooking, I know that there's a game you like to play called Get More Gin.
Yep.
And so what I want to do is ask you a few questions or throw you a few food ideas. And if you could tell us how to make that better with gin, that would sounds like a lot of fun. So first of all, just in general, are there dishes that, I mean, it's normal for people to pair wine and foods. So what about gin and foods?
So when you talk about pairing, there are some great ways that you can enjoy gin with food pairing. So gin and cheese goes really well together. I've hosted many gin and cheese evenings. And that's because when you start looking at the flavour profiles of gins, you can start looking at how they work really well with cheeses. Now, you can either get really scientific about it and talk about, blues and dairy content and the acidity and ewe's milk and goat's milk and hard cheese and soft cheese and all those sort of things. But again, this is your enjoyment with gin. So if you have a few selections of gins, now a good way to do that is through gin boxes. Now, I don't know if they're as popular in the US as they are in the UK. Dawn, are you nodding there? Is it a thing?
I told you I don't know that much about gin, so it's not something I've looked for.
So in the UK, we have gin delivery companies that produce boxes every month. Now, a really good way to do that is to look at companies that do sample selections, and they tend to come in thirds. So you'll get 3 bottles instead of 1. And normally you'll get, so this one's a cask aged, this is a Scottish gin, which is T. Smith's. So this has an Earl Grey undertone to it, which is a really good flavour profile. This is a fantastic one. This one comes from a distillery called Adnams. They're a brewery. They're a really, really old brewery, and they decided to make gin using beer hops or their own beers. And this one, the flavour profile on this one is matcha and lemongrass, but it's got a little bit of wasabi in it as well, so it's nice and hot. So if you do a Google search for sort of gin boxes and gin delivery companies, you may well find that you have an equivalent. But these are really good because then rather than buying full bottles, you can buy 3 little ones and you can take it home with 3 cheeses and sit there all evening just going, does this go with this cheese? Does that go with that cheese? And just enjoy that process. But if you think about it logically, a lot of the fruit profile gins will go really well with cheeses because they're almost like port. So when you start looking at that sweetness and that alcohol base, you're starting to see how those can go really well with cheeses. Gin and chocolate is another really good pairing. So when you start looking at the different levels of cocoa content, so start looking at milks, start looking at really good sort of dark chocolates, they go really well, and you can start having pairing nights with that. These are just things that are fun to do. Obviously, I would always promote responsible drinking. I'm not talking about drinking entire bottles. I'm talking about having a small taste of gin alongside chocolate to see if it enhances the flavour. And this is about having fun with friends. So that's really important. But also, when you start looking at how alcohol is used in cooking, gin and white spirits are just as good as whiskies and dark spirits. When you start seeing, lots of food that is cooked with those, think about how alcohol enhances food through things like tempura batters. We put beer or we put alcohol in batter to make it crisper. So, a gin enhanced batter is a fabulous thing. We obviously have to consider when cooking with gin several things. So the first really important thing is it's alcohol. So that alcohol flames. So when you're using alcohol in small amounts for the flavour, think about using it safely. So you don't want to start throwing in loads of alcohol into a deep fat fryer and not expecting horrific consequences. What you can do is put small amounts of alcohol into your food to get better flavours from it. Simple things are desserts. Gins go really well in desserts. So I do a really fantastic Black Forest Gâteau trifle. But what I do is I soak my cherries, and I just use frozen black cherries. And for 4 days in advance of making the dish, I will soak frozen black cherries in alcohol. I will then use those cherries. Then are lovely and soft. They've started to give over some of their natural juices. So I will use the cherries. So it will be chocolate, a Swiss roll or a sponge. I then use some of the liquid that's come off, which is gin and cherry juice, over that. And then I will put the cherries on it, and then a whipped cream. You can also add things like custards and jellies, so you can make a really lovely, rich custard to put on it that's set, but put like some really nice vanilla through it, and start to look at gins that have vanilla profiles, so you can add those to it. You can even whip through some gin through your cream, so you've got another gin profile there, and then cook down some of that gin and cherry juice at the end, so it becomes a sticky sort of syrup, and then cool that and then pour that over the top. That in itself is a fabulous way to enjoy Black Forest Gâteau trifle, but with a gin twist. I'm not suggesting for one moment that you put gin in every meal, but just think about how you use those. Well, you could, and I'd love to try it. Maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll do gin for a week and see how it goes. But yeah, there's loads of ways you can use gin.
Well, in the interest of time, I think you've actually covered a lot of basics, like using gin-infused fruit. That would actually work for a lot of different desserts. But I think what we're going to do is, since we need to kind of start wrapping things up, I did want to ask you, what do you do outside? I mean, we've talked a lot about gin, but what do you do outside of gin and cooking with gin?
Well, my daytime job is actually very different. So I'm head of marketing at a place called the National Space Centre, which is a visitor attraction in Leicester, which is a city right in the middle of the UK. And so my daytime job is actually working for a charity that educates and inspires people using the medium of space. So at the moment, we're having a fabulous time because, there's all kinds of things happening with SpaceX and Virgin and Blue Origin. And so there's lots of really exciting things happening around the world that are used as an inspiration to try and look at children or the next generation of scientists, mathematicians, engineers. And in the UK at the moment, we have this huge UK space industry that's looking at satellite technologies. We're doing lots of work on rovers that are off to other planets. So I get a really interesting scientific job. But I'm really lucky in the fact that I'm a massive sci-fi geek. So I managed to crowbar a bit of science fiction into it so I can utilize popular culture to sort of educate through science as well. And during lockdown, I've been really lucky. I've hosted lots of online Q&As, and we've been supported by the likes of NASA. So recently I got to interview Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley, who were the SpaceX NASA astronauts, who were the first SpaceX astronauts to go to the International Space Station, which for me personally was a fantastic experience, and I loved every minute of it. So I'm really lucky. I get to have fun every day, and then I come home and I'm surrounded by gin. And at weekends, I get to do lots of things with gin. So before I was in a lockdown situation in the pandemic, I used to do something called Walk with the Spirits. So I go on historical ghost walks around some of the fantastic ancient cities that we have around us. And I serve gin along the way. So we always start with a Geneva. We always then go on to an Old Tom. We'll do a London Dry. We'll do a Navy Strength, and when I'll try and finish off with something unusual. So this week's unusual was this one. This one's called Moonshot Gin. So this is from the Boutique Gin Company, who do some really weird gins. And most of the time, it's just purely because they can. But this particular one, the botanicals for it were put in a weather balloon, taken to the edge of space. So they have had some exposure above the Kármán line. I think they might have made it that far. And then they've used lunar meteorite dust in the distillation as well. So this one is a really quirky one. So I always like to throw in a weird curveball. So that was this week's curveball.
So I know that the National Space Center has a YouTube channel. Mm-hmm. And just remember, those of us in America, that remember to spell center with an R-E. But where else can people find you? Do you have your own channel for your cooking, or are you on social media?
Yeah, so I'm on Facebook. I'm the Gin Lady. I must say, at the moment, I've been very busy at my main job, so all of this has been very much on hold. But we do have our first bookings coming up for some gin talks that we're doing with some art galleries. So we're going to be doing some stuff where people will be creating their own artwork based on the botanicals. That we're going to be doing some tastings, and we do have some Walk with the Spirits. So that sort of thing's coming up. But my Facebook channel is full. If you go back and have a look of hundreds of recipes that we've created throughout the last 3 or 4 years that we've been cooking live at various conventions. So yeah, that's where you can find me. And if anybody has any questions, or if anybody wants to complain if I get things wrong, I do try to remember stuff, but it's been 16 months of working on spacey stuff, so it's been a while. Do get in touch. I'm on Facebook as the Gin Lady, and yeah, that's me.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Malika, for all this fantastic education and even entertainment and history lesson when it comes to gin. So remember, you can find Malika on YouTube with the National Space Center, and you can also find her own Cooking with Gin on her Facebook page. So look for that. Thank you very much for joining us, and look for the rest of our programming.